presenters are Dr. Ludger, Viefhues-Bailey, and he is a distinguished professor of philosophy, gender and culture at the Moyne University, New York. He's going to present about the civilizational populism and the making of sexualized cultural Christianity. So our fourth speaker of today is Dr. Valeria Reggi. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Venice and adjunct professor and tutor at the University of Bologna. So her presentation is going to be about the Imagine No More Small Boost in the channel, how populist parties and their leaders normalize globalization in their communication on social media platforms, and multimodal discourse analysis. And the last speaker is going to be Jarosław. Can you help me? Suchoples. From Central Europe, University of Warsaw. He's a former Polish ambassador to Finland, and his presentation is going to be about the populism from a double perspective, Timo and the Finnish version of the populism. Thank you again. I would like to give the floor to the moderator. Last week we have to be very sharp and punctual about the timing, but you can keep all your original timings.
Thank you. So I'll keep my remarks for the end, and I'll give the floor to Erin. So you can start. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here and to speak with you today. Congratulations to the organisers on a fabulous conference. So this is a more theoretical contribution to our discussion. I'm firmly of the view, as many speakers have emphasised, that religion and populism as social and political phenomena can only be studied in context and with precision about what we are referring to with these concepts. But at the same time, I have this suspicion that there is something present at the level of what Johann Galtung talks about as deep culture, or what Jose Casanova calls doxa or unthought, in the modern nation state and state system that is shared across many contexts, related to the intersections of religion as a category of governance. So I'm not talking about specific religions, but rather religion as a category of governance, secularism as the mode of that governance, identities, truth and power, something that is spread through colonisation and globalisation around the world. And that's what I'm trying to tease out in my 15 minutes this morning. Probably not going to succeed, but we'll give it a go. Give it a red hot crack. It's a work in progress. I'm still thinking through a lot of what I'm talking about here, so questions and comments are most welcome. I want to make 4 points. The first is that we are undoubtedly living through an age of identity politics that is closely tied to populism, the rise of the far right and increasing polarisation. I suspect many people are going, yeah, duh. Don't worry, I'm going to unpack that a little bit. The second point is that religion is at the heart of our current political moment in implicit and explicit ways. The third point is that what I think is unique about our particular age of identity politics compared with others is the impact of social media and AI. They exacerbate polarisation, feed misinformation and disconnection, and create a potential breeding ground for totalitarianism. And the fourth point is that as such, building trust and social connection are crucial to our current project.
Sorry, can somebody change the slide?
I don't have slides, this isn't my presentation, sorry. Yeah. But the question, of course, is how do we build trust and social connection? I'm going to share a few thoughts on that at the end if we have time. Okay, so unpacking point one a little bit. We are living in an age of identity politics. Okay, there's issues around gender, sexuality, race and immigration. Even support for science and action on climate change have in some places become identity issues because they are seen as left or progressive and are therefore also associated with a quote-unquote woke political agenda. But I want to nuance this observation a bit. Identity politics aren't new. We've always lived in an age of identity politics because our social relationships have always been structured around group identities that include and privilege some and exclude and demean others. The basis of those collective identities changes, but that identities are a crucial part of how we organise our societies is a relative constant throughout history. In the contemporary political moment, there are, I think, two key spheres in which identity politics are playing out. One that is focused predominantly around national identities, which is manifesting in relation to migration, but which is also becoming more pronounced in the context of trade wars and a kind of discursive identity power politics, to borrow from Janice Bialy's term, such as Trump's threat to make Canada the 51st state or to invade Greenland, which has arguably then prompted equally forceful assertions of nationalism in recent elections in Canada and Australia, for example. A second that is more concerned with specific personal characteristics, or a second kind of identity politics concerned with in gender, sexuality, ability, what Nancy Fraser has termed recognition politics. I think there are clear overlaps between these two, between an assertion of national identity and assertion of a specific personal characteristic-based identity. And as much as recognition politics perhaps focuses on individual personal characteristics more, it is still also about the politics of who belongs to a particular community, a particular political community, and who doesn't. And so recognition politics is the demand by racial, ethnic and sexual minorities that their distinctive perspectives and experiences of the world be acknowledged as different from, yet equal to, and just as valid as that of majority communities. And these calls to pay attention to all of the ways in which a culture structured around a presumed dominant, universal, quote-unquote, human-neutral identity against people, continuously discriminates against people who do not fit this prevailing identity, have been associated with this woke political agenda. And recent electoral successes of the far-right parties who have made anti-wokeism an explicit part of their agenda is an obvious backlash, which we've heard quite a bit about this morning. So, point one, contemporary identity politics is characterised by contestations over national identity and recognition politics, which overlap and map onto each other in certain instances. Second point, religion is at the heart of our current political moment, entangled with this politics of identity in three ways. The first of these is the influence of doctrines from specific religious movements, shaping moral truth claims and related policies. Undoubtedly, we can see the influence of conservative versions of Christianity in movements in the US, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, also conservative Hinduism in India, conservative Islam in Turkey, the use of gender equality and sexual minority rights to emphasise differences between global north and global south in some cases, to underscore Russia's claims to be defending true Christianity against the corruption of the West through its war in Ukraine, the polarising effects of the Hamas attacks and the war Israel is waging on Gaza, leading to rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. But I think the Israel-Gaza example hints that something deeper is going on. Religion is also part of our identity politics at a more fundamental level. Religion is entangled with our racial, national, ethnic identities in ways that we do not always realise or are not entirely conscious of. Anya Topolsky has made clear that the significance of religion for how we differentiate between people groups and the hierarchies we construct based on this differentiation stretches back throughout history. Up until the 18th century, religion had been the primary way in which Europeans had endeavoured to categorise the peoples of the world. This reflected the power that Christianity, through both its institutions and its worldview, held in the European context. Christianity for a long time was considered the only religion. All other belief traditions and the people groups associated with those traditions were considered inferior, not worthy of the label of religion. This created a template where religion offered the primary means of categorisation, but it also married religious identity with other markers of differentiation, including skin colour, culture, geographic origins, markers of differentiation that would eventually become more explicit. And with the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions, the privileged position that Christianity had enjoyed began to waver. A system of categorisation of peoples based on religious differentiation was no longer consistent with the broader move towards science and secularisation. With the burgeoning of the new scientific field of philology, which traced the history and development of languages, new, supposedly more scientific categories were developed that would replace the religious classification of people groups. These categories were Semitic, Aryan, and Turanian. While intended to refer only to groups of languages, as the science of philology developed and colonial empires and encounters expanded throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the classification was soon applied to people groups, with the term race also emerging during this period. And of course, initially, Semite incorporated Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew speakers, meaning that Jews and Arabs were categorised together. But it was European Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who were the primary targets of racism against Semitic peoples. During this same period, where religious categorisations of people groups are morphing through philological to racial and religio-racial identities, nationalism also emerged as a key political and ideological force, and soon became the primary mode of political belonging through its marriage to the administrative structures of the state. Yet, as Radhika Mongia makes clear in her work, nationalism takes over these aspects of religion and race as key markers of identity and belonging, using them to determine who does and does not belong to the nation state. As Wendy Brown notes in her pivotal volume, Regulating Aversion, neither women nor ethnic racial minorities such as Jewish people were initially emancipated in the new nation states of Europe. Both had to make a case for their inclusion alongside white propertied men. For women, this argument was made based on equality with men, while for Jews it was made on the grounds of tolerance. In response to their demands for inclusion, Brown notes that Jews were increasingly racialised to clearly distinguish them from quote-unquote native citizens. Meanwhile, women were overly sexualised in order to emphasise their differences from men. These religio-racialised and sexualised modes of othering remain central components of our politics. It is not that populist and far-right politicians introduce these tropes, rather they make pre-existing implicit hierarchical divisions explicit, and they celebrate those divisions. The third way in which religion is part of our present identity politics is through the secular governance of religion and the supposed privatisation of its truth claims that has contributed to the relativisation of moral truth. As Wendy Brown has observed, the privatisation of moral and theological truth claims required by 17th century religious tolerance settlements, proposed by thinkers such as Spinoza, Milton, and perhaps most famously and influentially by John Locke, attempted to deprive the state of matters of collective belief beyond the purely constitutional. In moving moral and theological truth from the public to the private realm, the Lockean settlement produces localised sites of truth and communities built around moral truth claims. Not only does this occur for religious communities, but it also, Brown suggests, explains the emergence of sub- and supranational communities organised around ethnicity, gender, sexuality, culture and religion. And these are to a degree the result of a privatisation of moral, ethical and religious truth claims. What we see too is that these sub- and supranational truth communities become entangled. Opposition to abortion, gender and sexual equality often also align with the scepticism of science and opposition to climate change. Sometimes this is tied together as part of a religion-secular binary, with religious communities feeling under threat from a broad liberal, secular, progressive coalition. The truth that is permitted to be public is relatively thin. Further, however, the separation of moral truth claims from what Brown labels constitutional principles creates the illusion that the truth claims promoted by the state are abstract and universal. It ignores the reality that public truths are shaped by those in power. Thus, not only are public truth claims thin, they are also precarious and vulnerable to manipulation by those who control the public production of knowledge and discourse. This makes factual truth, in Hannah Arendt's terminology, as relative as philosophical and moral truth. The difference being that factual truth is supposed to be something that we all agree on and that provides the foundation for our collective lives. When factual truth becomes relativised, the foundations for a flourishing, peaceful, inclusive and just society crumble. If factual truth no longer provides the stable meeting place in which sub- and supranational moral truth communities can come together to negotiate how they live together, despite their vastly different philosophical and theological ontologies, mistrust and division in society grows. Point 3. What is unique about our age of identity politics compared with others is the impact of social media and AI and their exacerbation of polarisation, feeding of misinformation and disconnection. which creates a potential breeding ground for totalitarianism. Economist Norina Hertz has noted in her book, The Lonely Century, how the atomised ways we live in contemporary society are contributing to isolation, marginalisation and loneliness, and that this in turn is feeding the rise of far-right politics. In the midst of feeling lonely, devalued and abandoned and hostile, far-right politicians offer people a community or a tribe that they can belong to, and I think this also harks back to our previous speaker's presentation. Hertz is not the first person to notice the link between extreme politics and loneliness. Hannah Arendt, in her seminal work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, observed that isolation may be the beginning of terror. It is certainly its most fertile ground. She also wrote that loneliness is closely connected with uprootedness and superfluousness. Now, not all populisms are authoritarian and do not necessarily result in totalitarianism, but their characteristic mistrust of established political institutions, corrupted by the elites, creates openings for totalitarian-style governance, disguised as true democracy in the name of the people. Arendt and Hertz's observations regarding the links between loneliness, isolation, and right-wing authoritarian-style politics should at least give us pause for thought. Final point. Given all of this, building trust and social connection are crucial. But how do we do that? And that was the question that I was left with after our discussion at dinner last night. I have to admit the discussion at dinner last night made me feel incredibly depressed and hopeless. And I wanted to ask, what do we do? What are our options? I'm sorry to say I don't have any definitive answers to that. The two things I can come up with is that we have to try to build a commitment to a shared collective public moral truth, recognising that such a project is never complete. Moral truth is never settled, because the minute we fix the parameters of our truth, we close ourselves off to critique and criticism, to new perspectives, analysis and insights, generating possibilities for the abuse of power, for discrimination, marginalisation, persecution and exclusion. This obviously presents us with a conundrum, because arguably to build such collective shared public moral truths requires a desire, a will to commit to living well together. It requires a pre-existing commitment to a shared moral truth that all people matter equally, and all deserve to have their perspectives heard and included. And it seems to me that we have to focus on building acceptance of this principle as a shared moral truth before any others are possible. And this final thought is something that I'm still kind of playing with, so it's only half formed. But I wonder what would have happened if, instead of privatising theological and moral truth in the name of establishing a thin collective truth of tolerance that Locke and others of his time proposed, what if instead they had sought out a different kind of shared moral truth? That the conflicts that everyone had endured had left them all in pain, grieving and suffering. Yesterday I raised this question of collective trauma, and I wonder whether acknowledging one another's collective trauma without comparing or relativising it provides a basis for shared moral truth from which we could then build the will to live well together. And I don't know, but maybe it's worth a shot. Thank you.
Thank you, that was amazing. And as you will see, there are some overlaps. What I'm sharing with you is from a book called No Separation, Christian Democracies and Sex from Columbia Press. And just to give you some kind of methodological throat clearing, I'm really interested in the fact that exclusionary populists, so I distinguish between inclusionary and exclusionary populist movements, are all obsessed about sex and religion and citizenship. So I'm interested in that Venn diagram. And while a lot has been talked about their obsession with sex, there's not really a lot of theorizing about it. And I today want to give you a little bit of that theorizing. So the main claim is that the meeting of democracy, understood as a mode of governance, and secularism, understood as a mode of governance, present an opportunity structure for the production of cultural religion in the service of the cultural and biological reproduction of the people. So one thing you need to take home is there is no such thing as religion. Religion is produced, and religion is produced as a problem space. So the goal is not to find answers, but the goal is to recreate questions, and through that recreation of questions, we produce power that we then can distinguish, that we can distribute differently. So I conceive democracy and secularism as problem spaces, and the problem space of democracy asks who belongs to the people, who are imagined as the sovereign of the state, and the problem space of secularism asks what is the line between state power and religious power. So again, no answers, but the continued question of posing of these questions produces power. And cultural religion is the product of that, and here I'm a bit against Wendy Brown. So I think it's uprooted from unquestionable ordinary practices. It is public. It's not the private. So secularism is not about the privatization of religion. It's not. It's about the creation of a particular public moral imagination for the service of the people. So cultural religion as dispositif is uprooted from unquestionable practices. It's produced in multiple publics, wild publics like gossip, or organized publics like the law. It's produced by multiple uncoordinated agents in multiple arenas pursuing various goals. So there's no great master or mistress mind behind it. And it's responding to a political urgency. You can hear Foucault. And the urgency that I'm talking about, and it's rehashing lots of things that we already mentioned, is related to the reproduction of the people. So I refer here to Chantal Mouffe, who claims that modern democracy exists as a tension between a liberal logic of democracy, of universal human rights. And I would say wokeness is in line with that, because we can all be ourselves and our sexualities don't matter because we're all humans. And liberal logic on the one hand, and then the democratic logic of democracy based on the popular sovereignty of the people, of a particular people, which then raises the question, who are we as the people? And again, the people are not there, the people are being produced through different social political practices. So democracy then needs to construct peoplehood, and that means that any democracy needs to do the work of external differentiation, and here Carl Schmitt is big, external differentiation, and that of internal cis heterosexist libidinal structuring. Internal cis heterosexist libidinal structuring. And there you can already see that these populist movements have to be obsessed about controlling women's bodies and controlling who counts as a woman. So the work of external differentiation, we have heard it a lot, is the affect of animus. I am not like you because I hate you. That's the friend-enemy distinction, and we saw this really painfully in the documentary snippets from Rwanda. So I don't need to really expand on that. But democracies also can only function if they reproduce their people. And hence the need for this internal cis heterosexist libidinal structuring. So all democracies need a particular erotics of citizenship. So internally, citizens must be erotically oriented to one another because they need to have sex in order to reproduce the nation. So democracy requires a heterosexual libidinal orientation. And at this point, we can still square this with the human rights logic of democracy, because according to that logic, everybody is equal, and maybe sexual romance requires that we are all equal. So that can really align with a romantic, erotic sexuality. But at the same time, reproducing the people also requires something else. Namely, certain bodies need to be defined as women, and those bodies need to be tasked with the task of reproducing the people. And therefore, their sexual freedoms must be subordinated to that task of reproduction. So if there was the question of are we living in fascism, every democracy lives in fascism. It's built in. It's a feature, not a bug. And every democracy needs to control women's bodies. So Democracy then requires not only a heterosexual, but a cis heterosexist libidinal organization, because we need to be able to identify certain bodies as women in order to burden them unequally with the labor of reproduction. Right? If we couldn't do that, we didn't know whom to unequally burden. While we could reproduce the people through migration, the racialized ethno-nationalism implied in the democratic logic of democracy towards the outsider makes this undesirable. The sovereign people are defined in rejection of those who are others or alien and not part of our body politics, and the passion of enmity that defines the people towards the outside prohibits their reproduction through migration. And in a time of economics that we have heard in the previous panel, where migration is a global issue, we should expect political movements to arise that highlight this animus. So as the sociologist Nira Yuval Davis, oh there she is, notes, some citizens in a democracy, namely those who can bear children, must live under a legal regime that forces them into taking on the labor of reproduction. From this perspective, their reproductive bodies are property of the state. Indeed, the democratic logic of democracy demands it. Democracy then implies a dual claim. All citizens are equal, and their sexualities and races, etc., don't matter. And yet, some citizens must be burdened with the cost of reproducing the people because of their sexual biology. Biology does and does not matter for the status of citizenship and what it entails. This dual nature of citizenship affects women in particular. They have a dual body, as it were. On the one hand, their bodies, like those of other citizens, are their own. Their biology does not matter politically. On the other hand, their bodies are wardens of the state, pressed into service for the reproduction of the people. This dual nature of citizenship of women's bodies reflects the tension between the liberal logic and the democratic logic of democracy. And this tension provides an opportunity structure for the creation of theologies of gender complementarity or of gender ideology. So also, doctrines are not simply there. Doctrines are being made through the political context. So it doesn't help you to study the history of doctrines. You need to study what doctrines do in a particular context. So, gender complementarity, yay. So produced globally by a coalition of European and American Roman Catholic and American white evangelical elites, the doctrinal innovation, and it is an innovation, it's not tradition. So don't talk about traditional gender roles, it's an innovation. This doctrinal innovation of gender complementarity functions both locally in the United States to incentivize reproduction in the private sphere, while using the power of the state to police reproduction. They naturalize exclusive binary cis heterosex, claiming that men and women are equal, while at the same time marking women's bodies as public property to be uniquely burdened with reproducing the people. So again, gender complementarity does this dual work of equality and inequality. In that sense, gender complementarity reflects the libidinal tensions inherent in the both logics of democracy. The modern discourses of gender complementarity and gender theory allow for the creation of a sexual political power by enabling a nuanced coalition building, one global on global and on local levels. Globally, the discourses of gender theory arose in the late 1990s within the context of interreligious theopolitical collaborations with the Vatican and Islamic states in an effort to oppose and weaken the incorporation of women's and LGBTQ rights in international legal frameworks. For example, the Vatican invited to a Humanum conference a variety of religious actors despite profound theological differences between those. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints were there, Southern Baptists, Orthodox Judaism, and Islam. They were all there among the representatives of world religions, invited to celebrate the beauty of marriage, in the words of the organizers. The conferences are more a media-savvy celebration of united oppositions to gender ideology than a forum for theological nuances. While then Pope Francis noted that marriage is not dissolvable by divorce, this position is not endorsed by the evangelical churches. The former UK Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks took pains to argue that polygamy is destructive, a position that is not shared by all forms of conservative Islam. And contrary to a host of traditional Catholic theologians, the head of the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission argued that sexual differentiation is not part of the fallen order that will be overcome. Besides pointing out the Catholic position on divorce, Pope Francis did not press his religious colleagues on any other points. So there's no theological debate. This was a media production of an innovation for political purposes. So the Vatican, as a political actor, produced a sexual theology around the discursive opposition of gender theory and gender complementarity, and to do so, it enables a network of intertextuality. And that network of intertextuality produces an internationally sourced discourse that uses natal reproductive biology to naturalize the claim that maintaining a binary order of the sexes is essential for a flourishing human society. The moral, diplomatic, and material resources of the Roman Catholic Church helped nurture and build these networks. Precisely because their particular theological investments are thin, and because the framing discourse of complementarity and gender theory are highly modern and thus compatible with secular policy making, these actors can deploy this capital for a variety of local goals. This makes the discourse of complementarity and the theology of gender theory into a nimble theological political tool for various local and global conflicts. Think of it like a VW. It's globally produced and it's locally used. Despite its complex and varied provenances, we can identify two core concerns in this political theology of sexuality, one critical and one constructive. Critically, the anti-gender movement claim that contemporary LGBTQ+ and feminist forces propagate an ideology an ideological and thus untrue understanding of human sexuality, one that is disconnected from its natural grounding. These people don't read actual feminist or LGBTQ resources, they just deposit this that what's going on here is unnatural. Constructively, however, the sexual political theology emerging out of the rejection of gender ideology is one of gender complementarity. And according to this position, the non-ideological understanding of human sexuality reflects that sexuality is beyond human intervention. It's simply structured by the cis-heterosex dimorphism of our biological bodies. It's simply there. Biology then normatively constrains sexuality and gender. This model allows to naturalize a society's heterosexual organization and stratification. How we organize as societies our sexual and erotic identities or relationships is not the result of social actions, institutions, and thus choices, so no moral interrogation there, but these organizations are simply given through biology. Our biological nature simply is our social destiny. Choice and responsibility in creating our sexual order has fallen by the wayside. In sum, doctrinally innovative, anti-choice, heterosexist, and anti-trans Christian theologies of gender complementarity respond to the contradictory erotic politics that democracy requires. They produce and naturalize exclusive binary heterosex, claiming that men and women are equal, while also marking women's reproductive bodies as public property, to be uniquely burdened with the reproducing the people. Produced in global and local political, theological, and cultural networks, these are then ready to be mobilized for both global and local policymaking. But they derive their plausibilities from an urgency built into the democratic project itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, of course, thank you very much for having me here. As you can see from the title, my perspective is from a linguistic perspective. So my take on populism is from the perspective of multimodal discourse analysis. To be fair, and I was discussing this yesterday, I felt a bit an imposter syndrome being here as a linguist, because being among experts in populism from a theoretical, from a political point of view, an economic point of view. And then I asked myself, so what is the point actually of investigating populism from a linguistic perspective? And I have had to remind myself that basically you need representations for to build contingent identity. So to build and strengthen this idea of antagonist groups, you definitely need to build representations, and this happens in discourse. Actually, all politics is actually grounded in discourse. So I found definitely even more motivation in this presentation. So what type of representations are we talking about? So we're talking about representing us versus them. And for right-wing parties, this consists mainly in representing us as nation, as cultural, with our cultural identity, as opposed to others that are usually constructed as foreign others. But also, it's very important, especially for populist communication, to focus on the identity of the leader, the charismatic leader that is essential in this process of identity construction. So what happens is that you need to select narratives, erase complexity, and of course, through this, or increase polarization. But this, to be successful, needs a process of normalization. So dominant discourse needs to come to be seen as natural and legitimate. So what I'm going to do now is to present a series of case studies that span along a 4-year time period, all carried out and partly ongoing from different perspectives with different research objectives. But I think they could be quite relevant to be presented today, because I think I could spot a trajectory towards the normalization of civilizational populism. Of course, this will need further investigation, and I'm also advocating for more possibly interdisciplinary cooperation, also because linguists, and not talking about myself, but talking also about my colleagues, much more established colleagues, do have a real incredible treasure of information about political discourse and populist discourse. So I will focus on studies concerning Jourdain Bardella and Marine Le Pen for National Rally, Giorgia Meloni and Matteo Salvini for Italy, Brothers of Italy and the League, and Nigel Farage and Richard Tice for Reform UK. The overarching research questions are focus on the way these leaders build the identity of the in-group and out-group, the discursive strategies they use. Of course, I will present very, very, very general results because we don't have time that would require hours, but if you're interested, I'm definitely available to provide all details. And if the out-group is defined in civilizational terms, and if it has changed and become more normalized in time. So the material involves the two data sets I will be focusing on are material from 2021 and 2024, basically from social media and websites. Of course, websites represent official party communication, and are also quite interesting in the development of what is missing in 2024 when some parties have become power party, government parties, which is also quite interesting, all the information that was deleted. Social media, of course, as we all know, they provide unmediated relationship with the electorate, with very little gatekeeping, platform for the intimization of personalization of communication. And the shift from X to Instagram was due basically to the evolution of these two platforms, so difference in ownerships and also in the popularity for institutional communication. And the focus on the party leader as a role model I've already talked about. The methods were and still are qualitative and multimodal with manual annotation, but because the data are really quite bulky, I mean, I can rely on a quite significant data set. I've used the categories of emotions following Bliuc that you can see listed here, and also appraisal categories, both refer to images and text, because my studies are all multimodal, so I also focus on emojis and also the way images are represented, drawing upon Crescent van Leuven for image analysis, so drawing also upon social semiotics. The rationale for these two periods is actually that they are strongly related to general elections, local elections, so campaigning for these elections. And the time span is also quite indicative of the development of these parties' propaganda, also with reference to their political trajectories. These percentages are generally referred to polls or projections, but I've double-checked yesterday and they still seem to be quite accurate. So we have a significant increase of the National Rally, a very significant increase of Brothers of Italy, a surprising increase of Reform UK, and a dramatic drop of the League, even if the League is in the government with Brothers of Italy. Of course, I will not have that time to investigate on the impact that this has got on the communication, but it's quite significant. The ideologies, of course, here you get an idea of the history, the genealogy, and the ideologies of these parties. The ideologies, to be fair, are all quite similar. The genealogy is a bit different, with the National Rally and Brothers of Italy being on a straight line from the fascist party, that the Movimento Sociale Italiano, the social Italian movement that was founded after World War II. Others were more born like populist catch-all parties like the League. But I will focus on the relationship with religion that used to be quite secular for the National Rally. Secular or just not that present or relevant for Reform UK. Definitely pro-Christian for the League, that was born, like I said, out of the fascist party, so using the triad God, motherland, country as its foundation. And the League switching from agnosticism or even paganism to Catholicism when it joined the national arena, becoming strongly pro-Christian. So in terms of the outcome of analysis, in terms of the content of how identity was framed in 2021, we see that apart from the National Rally with a stress on secularism, we find mostly the strong presence of this Judeo-Christian tradition, whatever this means, mixed with Italian values, the ancient Rome, etc. But quite a significant insistence on Christian values. What is quite interesting, I found particularly interesting, was Tice's Sunday sermon. That is his weekly address to his audience that was really crafted up to a certain point as a sermon. So in which he showed himself as a preacher with a lot of visuals recalling mass, music, etc., etc. That I found really peculiar for a British audience. The outgroup, as you can see, was quite varied, with Islamism, terrorism, multiculturalism, the Roma community, human trafficking, birthright citizenships. I'm quoting the main topics that were quoted in slogans. Migrants who do not integrate, and then, of course, for Reform UK, the undemocratic EU, etc., and for all of them, political opponents. Now, what happened in 2024 is that we still have secularism, laïcité for the National Rally, but also some references to the Judeo-Christian tradition, both for Le Pen and Bardella. Brothers of Italy and Meloni becoming prime minister, the references to Christianity are definitely more vague and less overwhelming. Salvini, who used to kiss the cross and be very, very vocal about the defense of Christian symbols, etc., has turned into more institutionalized forms of celebrations, and we will see a few examples. Whereas we find some references to Judeo-Christian culture by Farage, which is some sort, to my best knowledge, a bit of a news in this. You can confirm that, okay, thank you. The outgroup, on the other hand, we find that is mostly focused on Islamism. Then the idea of illegal migrants as criminals. So we have this insistence on being different, being illegal, and being and committing crime because your culture is different, especially crime against women. So this idea of threat that is created, is generated by uncontrolled immigration, threat to social security, threat to the economy. So basically what we see in a nutshell is that immigration is equated to Islam. So for example, the Roma are no longer mentioned, and Islam is equated to Islamism. So there's this oversimplification. And overall, again, we pass from the idea of insistence of terrorism to migrants as threatening from a social and economic point of view. These, you get more or less an idea of this transition through the visual material. And what is interesting is that whereas Meloni described herself as a mother, a Christian, and sorry, I forget the whole, it's a woman, a mother, Italian, and a Christian, Le Pen defined herself a woman, a mother, a lawyer, and French. Whereas now she also showcases herself lighting candles in a church. Whereas, as you can see from Meloni and Salvini, is more recalling religious celebrations and religious festivities. There's not much insistence on that. And you can also appreciate the difference in the format of the Sunday sermon. A word about the emotions associated with the foreign other are, as you can expect, mostly fear. And this is also interesting in the way the others are framed visually. So we see a lot of black and red colors, a lot of threat that is mentioned, or of course together with the association with nasty criminals, foreign criminals, insistence on the origin, and so on and so forth. In terms of lexical strategies, we can observe many forms of nominalization, abstract concepts, and coinages. So basically, the agent is deleted, which allows indirect judgment without being too impolite, without being too aggressive. So basically, I target immigration, I don't target immigrants. Or we have coinages like Islamo-leftism, Islamo-Gauchism, or new totalitarianism, or Islamic fanaticism. So all these abstract concepts help the slogan and help politicians to become to express negative judgments without being too straightforward and being accused of hate speech and so on and so forth. So to conclude, I think that through the material I've gone through, I can outline the two phases that lead to normalization. So first of all, the introduction of new discursive themes, such as a common sense division between good migrants and bad migrants, the idea of multiculturalism as a threat that is taken for granted, stock phrases or imagery like the boats, Islamogauchism, totalitarianism, ethnic substitution, or a whole plethora of visuals, a shift in focus from terrorism to human trafficking and crime against women, all argumented. And then a second phase of perpetuation and gradation. So all these elements are recontextualized. Recontextualized how? Sometimes they're decentralized, which means that it's no longer the leader expressing certain concepts, but second or less prominent party figures, or they're expressed verbally. They're not, many visual campaigns are no longer there, have been deleted and taken away from websites. So there's nothing, this type of communication has become more volatile, but also at the same time has become institutionalized, so through bills and party programs. So overall, what we see is that radical positions and ideologies are becoming legitimized and made mainstream. So thank you very much. Oh, okay. Do you need the stand, everything? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Jarosław Suchoples. I am from co-organizer of this conference, Center for Europe, University of Warsaw. To tell the truth, I'm not scholarly. I'm not a specialist in the field of populism. I am quite classical historian, which I'm very proud of. But because I was, or I'm not only a historian, I would like to tell you a little bit about something which probably you are not thinking about every day, even in your professional activities. I would like to speak about populism in one of Nordic countries, Finland. Finland, which I am connected with for more than 30 years. And I would like to speak today about the creator of the Finnish populism, Timo Soini. Timo Soini, who has been, who was not only a populist, but also he was able to bring populism to the force in Finland. He was a deputy prime minister. He was also foreign minister of Finland for 4 years. But why I claim that I would like to present him in a double perspective, because Soini maintains that he is a practitioner of populism, but on the other hand, he also maintains that he is a theoretician, which is also the truth. In this context, I would like to, in a sense, give the floor to him, and I would like to discuss his own book, titled, of course, Populism, which became a relatively small platform for him to present his ideas and to present his views on populism as such. The other thing is, which probably I should mention, that Timo Soini is my personal friend. So I know probably more than you can find in so-called sources. Okay, so let's start. It is not so often that a politician whose ambition is to become a leader of the nation admits openly and proudly, "I'm a populist." But this is the case of Timo Soini, one of founders of the right-wing populist True Finns party, Perussuomalaiset, and the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Finland in the cabinet of Juha Sipilä from 2015 to 2019. In his compact book, Populism, published in Finnish 2019 and in English in 2020, Soini presents populism from a double perspective. A perspective of a theoretician and a political practitioner. Firstly, he briefly summarizes what, according to his own views and experience, is populism. He refers in this context to several analyses and opinions, not necessarily concerning populism directly, written or simply expressed by such scholars like Margaret Canavan, Roger Itwell and Matthew Goodwin, Rudolf Heberle, George Hall, Wojto Helander, Jordan Kyle and Lymor Galchin, Jan Werner Müller, Emilia Palonen, Joseph Schumpeter, Peter Wiles, as well as his own, because in 1988 Soini finished his master's thesis, written at the University of Helsinki. It was dedicated to the question of populism in Finland, perceived through the process of the changing role of the Finnish rural party. Then Soini explains the phenomenon of the Finnish populism in the light of his own experience and the 4Ds ideas taken from national populism, the revolt against liberal democracy, the seminal work by Itwell and Goodwin. This included the distrust of the elitist nature of liberal democracy, the destruction of whole professional groups and certain historical established ways of liberal politicians, money and supranational organizations, i.e. globalization. Globalization, the relative deprivation, being a result of the sense of increasing inequalities in the Western world. The alignment understood as a process whereby a large portion of the electorate abandons its hitherto political party affiliation. Soini also discusses the meaning of such terms like demagogues and redeemers, explaining the significance of the strong and charismatic populist leader who knows how to attract supporters and how to present the public opinion with own ideas, and the place of people in the thinking of populists, government, and the sovereignty of the nation. In the late 1970s, when he joined the Finnish Rural Party as a secondary school student, at that time Soini still had no answers of awareness of populism, but was somehow seduced by questions put forward by these party leaders, above all Veikko Vennamo. I think it is necessary to mention here that Finnish populism, in my opinion, is deeply rooted in 1970s, and it is one of results of a long-lasting rule of President Urho Kekkonen. Kekkonen was a leader of Agrarian League. So in 1970s, many people in Finland, many people belonging to the electoral base of Agrarian League, started to maintain that Kekkonen is not their representative anymore, that he is a politician who is deeply involved in matters of international politics, but he was not their representative anymore regarding internal politics and regarding problems of everyday life for average people. This is the reason why this rural party was created, and in fact it was a split party. I mean, it was a split within the Agrarian League. Only later, after 1970s, he made a deliberated decision to become a populist politician, which became a start point for his brilliant political career, ending with his crowning appointment as the Finland's foreign minister. The success story is described in 4 subsequent chapters of the book, which also help readers to understand technicalities of the political cuisine as applied by the populist politician who wish to gain popularity and as a result win hearts and minds of voters. Populism and its essence across the world. In some further part of the book, Soini dedicated much space to the presentation his views on his personal experience with populist leaders from 3 countries, who in some sense became iconic for all European and probably not only European populists. Nigel Farage from Great Britain, Jarosław Kaczynski from Poland, and the US President Donald Trump. Nevertheless, Soini discusses also populism across the world and its continents, as he titled a respective chapter. Here he refers to several examples from Asia and Latin America, as well as shares his views on the current situation and the future of populism in Africa. In the next chapter of his book, Timo Soini analyzes several questions which, as seen from his own perspective, seem to be important for populism perceived as a broader social and political phenomenon. He asks about the limits of the populism, and in this context discusses the situation of deputies representing populist parties from various countries in the European Parliament. In my opinion, here, these questions put forward by Soini, these are roots of his own problems within the populist movement in Finland. Finally, this populist party, populist movement, which he created, in fact, kicked him out. He used this background for further considerations about relations and contradictions between populism and right-wing populism, which he differentiated from each other, making remarks on populist movement developed in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, as well as the national loyalty of European populists. According to Soini, they try to defend the national tradition, its heritage, and in a broader sense, Judeo-Christian values, forming a cornerstone of the European Western culture. In final pages of the book, Soini shares his views on the role played by today's media and journalists in the political life and never-ending process of communicating of voters by politicians about their views and ideas. He underlines here the significance of the social media as a vehicle especially suitable for aims of the populist propaganda. In other words, Soini explains how important for the dissemination of the populist message among the public, often simplified merely to slogans, are channels offered by new technologies. At the very end, author served readers a few remarks about the future of populism. It seems that the very first of them, populism is alive and well, it will not disappear, only change shape, is a quintessence of views and all considerations presented by Soini. In my opinion, however, this book is a little bit one-sided, but possibly it is a valuable personal account. So I start a little bit to criticize him. The book of Soini is not a scholarly study per se. Instead, the book is rather his opinion about populism. Probably the most interesting parts of the book are the chapters where Soini describes his own political career. This can be read as a kind of a handbook for populism. A populist politician tells the readers his personal account about how the populist political movement in Finland was able to emerge, gain wider social support, and later on begin to play a significant role in the Finnish political life. However, the story presented by Soini is one-sided. Although certain scholars are occasionally mentioned, their views or research is not explicated much, and reflecting the matter in wider scale remains somewhat limited. Instead, the book is more of a success story of populism in Finland, told from its very beginning to the moment of its biggest electoral success. It all ended without much consideration given on why, after so many victories, if we agree that an electoral victory is an increase of the number of deputies far from the winning of the majority in the parliament, the True Finns party broke up in 2017, or why Timo Soini, its leader, was practically expelled from his own political organization. The chapters containing more theoretical remarks regarding the author are important and attract special attention. At least some of these remarks help to understand why populism became so attractive worldwide. In this context, it is difficult to disregard many opinions expressed by Soini. He explains where the strength of the populism had originated from. For example, Readers are told that populism is about emotions supported by belief in a set of traditional values. Moreover, populism through touching many social sensitive questions which nobody else had, according to Soini, wanted to discuss successfully challenges the agenda and positions of old parties. Soini also states that populism, with its hostility towards the big capital and establishment, as well as populism's idealizing of ordinary people, in other words, those who appreciate traditional values, family, religion, etc., closes the gap between the metropolitan elite and the rest of the country, a view of Nigel Farage shared by Soini. Soini is or has been one of the most prominent populist politicians in Europe. Therefore, his views on the European Union makes interesting and informative reading. Unfortunately, these notions have been scattered through the text. Nevertheless, I would like to mention that Soini maintains that he stopped to be so inimical to European Union. And why? Because, let us say, 20 years ago, he was very, very radically critical about the European Union, but because later he served as a deputy in the European Parliament, he also had to cooperate with structures, institutions of European Union as a foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Finland. He changed his opinion. He started to maintain that, okay, maybe European Union is not it's not totally positive organization, but we have nothing better. And in a given moment, a given historical moment, European Union positively influenced Europe and also Finland. Chapters revealing Soini's personal relations and/or his attitude towards populist leaders from other countries are less convincing. It seems that when writing, for example, his warm words about Nigel Farage, Soini totally forgot the destructive role played by the British populist politician, his obvious lies and manipulations broadly discussed in the media, which helped Farage to reach a goal of his life, is at the Brexit. Here another remark. Soini was here at the University of Warsaw 2 weeks ago. He gave a couple of lectures related mainly to foreign policy, not so much about populism. But I remember such a situation, and I also understood why he is so well disposed towards Nigel Farage. We were just about to take pictures of Soini together with students, etc. And in some moment, his phone started to ring. He said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I must pick up." And after a minute, he returned, of course, and he showed me his phone. Who was calling? Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage was calling, and I asked him, "Timo, why you like this guy so much?" "Because he's my friend." So this is that answer, which also should be taken into consideration, personal relations between people. Okay, maybe in media, maybe on TV, we know who Nigel Farage is, but Nigel Farage has also personal friends, his family, his friends, etc. So this is also an important factor influencing sometimes even political life on different levels. So we cannot exclude it, we cannot forget about this. Nevertheless, if Farage was obsessed by the idea of the Brexit, as Soini explicitly mentions, it should be also asked whether politicians guided by personal obsessions should be presented as reasonable fathers of their nations, or as persons leading them objectively towards the better future. This relates also to Soini's remarks about Jarosław Kaczyński and his Law and Justice Party. From Soini's book, it is possible to learn only that Kaczyński is an ideological, well-educated leader who oozed anti-communist and Catholic ideology. During the 90-minute long meeting he had with Soini in Warsaw at the end of 2018, So after such a short conversation, he was able to draw such far-going conclusions. For Soini, the case of Poland is yet another interesting success story of populism. Only this time, its Polish version, deeply immersed in the national history and tradition. Especially interesting for Soini is the fact that Polish populists won the majority as a result of parliamentary elections in 2019, when being already prominent in Poland. Nevertheless, Soini forgets that methods used by law and justice to secure this election victory could not be described as fully legitimate nor compatible with democratic standards. They were also contradictory to Soini's own opinion that elections must be fair and transparent. And this is another interesting conclusion, which is deeply immersed in the Finnish national identity. For the Finns, observing rules, observing law is a key element of their national identity. So when we consider different populist parties, leaders, we also must remember about one thing: what is or what are their national roots? What is important for them from this point of view? Soini also appears not to acknowledge that the program of the Law and Justice is a collection of attractive slogans, and the realization of its electoral promises extensive investing resources and money in mainly poor pensioners and families with children, highly praised for the former Finnish foreign minister, is ruining the finances of the state. Is ruining the finances of the state. He also does not analyze what motives really lay behind putting forward all these socially justified transfers of the national wealth and populist ideas connected with its redistribution. It is characteristic that Soini mentions Viktor Orban only once. The leader of Hungarian populism and his party Fidesz was named a prominent defender of the Judeo-Christian values in the European People's Party (EPP) group in the European Parliament. Soini tries to indirectly defend Orban and Fidesz by putting forward a question concerning the fact that Fidesz has not been ejected from the EPP, despite being the object of harsh criticism for undermining the rule of law. Not answering this question, he creates an impression that there is no reason why Fidesz should be expelled from the EPP. In his book, Timo Soini presents himself as an idealistically disposed, but at the same time pragmatic practitioner of populism, who is deeply rooted in principles of Christianity and who fully recognizes democratic rules in politics. Here we have another interesting element of his personality. Soini is a devoted Christian. He is a person who converted even to Catholicism. I'm just finishing. Yes, okay. He is a person who converted in Finland, in predominantly Lutheran Finland, into Catholicism, which also created some problems for him in this political level. But when he was here in Warsaw, and when he walked through the city, I was his guide here, he asked me several times, could we enter this church for a while, and something like this. And he prayed in a completely empty church. He prayed ardently. So I do not think that it was an element of this political theater. It results rather from his personal, deeply rooted convictions. His activities in Finland as a party leader and a member of the government allow believing that this image is rather an objective account. Nevertheless, it remains a questionable issue whether populist leaders in other countries should be perceived in the same way, taking into consideration the number of controversies surrounding them. Open, unanswered question also remains whether populism can be treated to some extent, at least, as a consistent socio-political doctrine or only as a protest movement without any overall concept of society. However, both for scholars and for general audience, populism, I mean here his book, will increasingly gain the value of the first-hand source about its author, his ideas and views, and times when it was written. And of course, to some extent, also about Finland in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Therefore, Timo Soini's opinions can be accepted or rejected, but cannot be neglected or disregarded. And probably the best summary of this is what he wrote in the introduction of this book. So he wrote, "In this book, I treat populism understandingly, without moral prejudices. I do not claim to be objective, as I always discuss my own actions." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Do we still have time for questions?
Yes, we
Yeah.
do. May I have the mic for the speakers?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will start with my own question. So I'm coming from a different discipline. I'm a political psychologist, and in my discipline, the way we see identity is, on one hand, is this sort of can't hear me. So we have the perspective of the subject, so the way our identity affects the way that we see the world. So we have this perceiver sort of perspective. But then we have also the discursive aspect of identity. So the identity is fully constructed and is a little bit of a thin construct. So we can the identity content is can be understood in different ways. So the same identity can be defined in very different ways. So that's very much related to what the speakers were talking about. But coming back to actually Erin's point at the end of your talk, I thought it was really interesting the way you're talking about this collective trauma and collective identity, and the way to maybe think of identity as a way of unifying people rather than fragmenting and dividing and polarizing. Like, I was wondering if the way in which we conceive of religion as an identity or not would be a way to, like, if you can comment on how we can think of those things from your perspectives for a way forward. I don't know, is it...
How do you think about...
Yeah, and if you think that the way of in which we define religion as an identity or as sort of more of a discursive device or a way to manipulate, like from the perspective of the communicator, would help us to maybe sort of advance the debate around the research we do. Does it make sense? The question.
If I understood the question correctly, which I think is, does religion provide us with a resource to build collective identities?
Yeah, or it's more of a barrier to. It can be used more to divide than to polarize.
It's both. But I also think that comes down to how we presently conceptualize what religion is in the public sphere. I actually think most the dominant understandings of religion that operate within the public sphere and within public discourse are a misrepresentation of how religion behaves on the ground, and that leaves it open to being manipulated for this kind of civilizational populism that's been being talked about in the context of this conference. So I think in relation to religion and identity, I think there needs to be an effort around religious literacy, not in the focus on quote-unquote world religions, because I think that's rubbish, to put it bluntly, but in how to read religion in society. So how to understand that religion isn't a single thing, it isn't clearly delineated, it is to paraphrase Alexander Bent, it is what people make of it. And so to understand that religion means different things for different people, and that this term carries different connotations, that there's that we shouldn't be talking about this in the singular. There's no one thing there's multiple Christianities, multiple Islams, etc., etc. And that instead what people need to be doing is employing curiosity to try and understand what religion means in specific contexts for particular people, rather than this immediate jump to judgment of religion as either good or bad. So that would, I think, is...
Yeah, I think
Does
so.
that answer your question?
Yes, I'll just add something at then.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in?
Yes, like I'll just say something in response and then. In relation to what you are saying, there is this quite trendy concept of intellectual humility. So the way to read the reality and to approach things is to use this intellectual humility to understand diversity. Thank you.
So I also think it's really important to understand how religion is construed through secularism, not secularity, but secularism as a mode of governance. And so one way to understand secularism is to ask the question, what is plausible for us? What constitutes a religion? What knowledge do we have about religion? And what do you need to do as a religious person to become legible in the public? And all of these things are infused with politics. And I think for the construction of religion, it's very important to not distinguish between what is my piety and what's my political use, but to see that both internal personal identities and social identities are interwoven. So I think what you said about your case, that he actually fervently prayed, is perfect, because real believers create this cultural religion for the production of the state in conjunction with people who have no religious liturgy and practice whatsoever. So the AfD, the people in East Germany who are pronouncing the Christian character of the German nation, they have no discernible religious practice. But at the same time, the Manif pour tous and the French case shows that we have deeply rooted religious actors through the Catholic Church connecting with bourgeois right-wing politics in order to create this religious plausibility.
Well, I don't have much to add, unfortunately, because the manifestations I saw were mainly instrumental to political propaganda. So basically there was a very instrumental and manipulative use of certain symbols and certain rituals, especially through visuals, or the appropriation of certain lexical terms, but no real trace of real commitment and real interest, but just a very simplified and minimal use of, and like I said, erasure of complexity. So basically we have Islam equates Islamism, and not any or so cultural differences that equals that equates to lack of respect for women and women's bodies, etc., etc. So a very instrumental use of religion.
So again, I would like to use an example of Finland, because I think it is a very good example. In the 1970s, 1980s, it seemed that Finland is a totally secularized country. But then, in 1990s and at the beginning of the 21st century, during electoral campaigns regarding local elections, but also parliamentary elections, the questions of religion became again, I don't want to say very important, but at least they were somehow significant. So at the end of the day, it appeared that Finland is not so secularized as many thought, that questions of religion are important for people, that Finland is more conservative than their partners in Scandinavia, which means that, for me, it's another argument that Finland is not a Scandinavian country, because it is cheesy. Therefore, I use in my research and also in my teaching more willingly the term Nordic countries or northern countries than Scandinavian countries. And but there's also another important element Here I would refer again to Timo Soini. Yes. He was a leader of a party, populist party. He constantly stressed the importance of moral values. He constantly quoted John Paul II and so on, which in Finland is not very often. It's a Lutheran country, not Catholic. And other leaders of his party started to think, who is this guy? Why he so often talk us about religion, about moral values, about all this blah, blah, blah. We are more cynical. We are politicians. We are not religious preachers, so to say. And here I see also a part of roots of his political problems within his own party, why he was expelled at the end of the day. Of course, it was not a decisive factor, but on the other hand, it created a kind of atmosphere around him.
Thank you. Any questions from?
I have just a very brief comments to Jarosław's talk. I attended Reform Conference as a researcher in September, and at the conference, which was very theatrical and sort of US-like, really quite spectacular event, there was only one foreign speaker, one foreign guest speaking on massive screen, and it was Timo. So clearly those friendships translate into political influence and forward connections. Thank you.
He's going to be the first.
Just a short question to Valeria Lecki. First of all, there's no need to select an imposter, right? Because linguistic-oriented discourse studies some complement to science or sociology, that's very well. So I think that's fair. So I have a question about, because you've mentioned the Islamization, right, and the links, populist parties trying to link migration with Islam or trying to make the issue as an Islamic invasion and so on. So I was wondering if you observe the same processes with regard to liberal mainstream parties. I'm asking this because we can talk about, for example, the case of Poland, where the ruling party has started to use some rhetoric in their visual materials as well. And we can also discuss the issue of Denmark, right, the social democrats, their approach to Islam and Muslims. So I was wondering if it's true in your cases as well, so in France, Spain, Italy, have these parties started to use such kind of rhetoric and discourse, or not necessarily?
Do you mean centre-left? Sorry, I didn't like centre-left, leftist party, yeah.
Centre-liberal. Yes.
Liberal, okay, yeah. I did not study the phenomenon and the discourse in the UK and France, but for my experience as an Italian citizen, they're definitely not using the same language. We have a populist leftist party that was the Five Star Movement, and they had quite an ambiguous relationship with immigration issues. So they were sort of, not taking any pro-migration or actually open stance on that, but they never used, to my best knowledge at least, this type of language or making these strong connections with Islam as a threat or migrants as a social and economic threat to the country. I mean, they had, when they take stances against open migration, is more from the perspective of having rules about that and not being able to accept everybody. This is more or less the stance. But these specific equations are typical of the right wing. But what is interesting is that they take them for granted. I mean, this is common knowledge, this is common sense. So of course I didn't have the time, but there's a whole bulk of analysis behind that, the rhetorical strategies they use, the type of tenses they use, the fact of being, the discursive attitude they have, that is definitely monoglossic. This is like that. There's no discussion about it. No use of modals, no use of maybe, no use of I think. So everything is given. and taken for granted. I don't know, did I answer your question?
Maybe this is maybe not in the scope of your research, right? Because you focus on populist parties, I assume, and I meant more mainstream parties, but it's not, within the scope of your research. But I think in the case of Italy, it's quite interesting, so I would take it.
It's quite messy as well, yeah.
Thank you very much. My question is for Erin. I spoke about truth, factual truth, collective truth, as well as moral truth. Just say that which are also contest normative steps to religions.
Could you hold the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth, right?
Yeah, okay. That truth stems from ideologies or religions, or legal understandings. But in the age of post-truth, it is so important to discuss, deliberate, or reflect on what is truth. I would like to ask whether your economist classifications of reality could be helpful to create a common ground for determining what is true. As you remember, we classify the reality as objective reality, subjective reality, and intersubjective reality. So intersubjective reality and the subjective realities maybe couldn't be taken as a common ground for truth, but the objective reality could be a source of determining truth for some approach. But do you see that any danger of making the truth by basing on the objective reality, the ultra-positivist approach, and not embrace all segments of the society so understanding? What will be common ground for the real truth?
Thanks for the question. And I'm still, before I try and answer it, I need to preface it by saying I'm still thinking through all of this. So the question really helps me to keep thinking about it. So the other aspect of this that I have been researching for a while is the aspect of ontological injustice. And so, there we go. Okay. So, the connection doesn't, okay. Anyway, so this whole idea of objective reality is also something that I think is questionable, because what do we base that objective reality on? And does everybody accept that objective reality? And what we see is that, what we have seen is that in privileging certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of evidence, there are traditional forms of knowledge from Indigenous peoples that have been devalued and excluded, and particularly in the context of a changing climate, that knowledge is actually crucial in helping us fight or develop solutions and new approaches. And that's where I think the fundamental element of power comes into this equation. Like, who has the power to decide what counts as real and what doesn't? Who has the power to say this is acceptable knowledge and evidence and this is not? And that power is power is relational. I think that was something else that came out of the conversations that we've had, is that not only do personal relationships matter in the construction of power, but also who we give power to as citizens also affects what counts as truth and what counts as reality. And that's why I don't think we can ever have a settled answer to this question of what is reality and what is truth. I think rather what we need to have is an ongoing conversation about what these things are, but we have to have some kind of fundamental principles that sit at the bottom of that, and those I would say are ensuring that people who have been traditionally marginalised and excluded, and forms of knowledge that have been traditionally marginalised and excluded, are included in part of that conversation, and that we try and ensure that the ultimate goal is that we all live together well, and that doesn't just include people, that includes species and the planet. But whether we can get to that point of those being the kind of foundations of our conversations around what is real and what is truth, I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the exact answer, we are searching for the answer.
Yeah, exactly right. I don't have the answers. I would not presume to have the answers. I'm just throwing out more questions and more ways of...
Thank you for the contribution.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Searching answer.
Thank you, super interesting. I think this one is also probably for Erin, but also the others. And it's on birthright citizenship. The thought is the following. If populism exists mainly in democracies because it is a tool to make people vote for you, and the vote, of course, is given to people who are citizens of that entity, whatever that entity is, then clearly the rules by which you acquire citizenship is particularly important. Not just because we want to create an identity, which in this case we see as a complete construct, namely the nation state, but also because you can then keep people out and marginalize them. Because, well, you don't need their vote, they don't vote, right? And we see that very much in the change of citizenship rules, and the British government, a Labour government, notably, is now proposing to double the length of time you need to reside in the country in order to acquire citizenship. It's also got one of the highest naturalization fees in Europe, I know because I had to pay it, in order to become British, which is a clear tax on voting. So the question is, and by the way, this also goes to Ludger's argument that those who believe that birthright citizenship and identity has to do with ethnicity in particular, obviously then have an incentive to make their own people reproduce, rather than getting, which would make a lot more sense, both in environmental and humanitarian terms, getting migrants to replace their own population. So the question is, how would you suggest that citizenship and birthright citizenship should be treated in the context of populism studies? Because there's something that we need to change about the law regarding citizenship.
Thought you were going to have a go at that question, actually. Is there something that... I'm not sure I've got a good answer for this. I might need to think about it a bit more, but I think the citizenship has always been a fundamental tool of inclusion and exclusion. I honestly don't know how you can change that, because even in the context of democracy in ancient Rome, it was only certain people who had the right to vote.
And not you and I.
Sorry?
And certainly not you and I.
No, exactly right, exactly. And this is something that worries me about what we're seeing with trends in citizenship, that with governments changing citizenship laws, taking citizenship away from people. In Australia, the right to vote for women is an act of parliament. It's not in the constitution. So, whereas the right for Indigenous people to vote is an amendment to the constitution. So, I mean, as it should be, because, I don't really have, other than something completely utopian and idealistic, I don't have a practical policy answer for this question right now, but I'm going to keep thinking about it. Thank you.
So, I want to comment a little bit on one assumption. I don't think that populism in a democracy is there to make people vote for you. I think populism and democracy responds to the democratic logic of democracy, which means we have to define who the people are. And citizenship legislation is definitely one brute force tool to do that. And what we see in the United States, the first slew of executive orders were all about who belongs to the nation. So in my book, I have a kind of tiered understanding of citizenship using Kant. I mean, there's like full active citizens who own the state, and then there are passive citizens who are who belong to the state but who don't have real ownership over the state. So the state expends benefits to them, but they don't really are enfranchised. And I think citizenship debates are over these questions: who is a full active citizen who can own the state through voting, and who is more like a beneficiary of the state. And the people who really fall out of that are for what Kant calls them kind of the savages. And that's the refugee population, right? So Hannah Arendt said human rights are great, but if you don't have a state kind of who co-opts you, who fights for you, you're lost. So I mean, the Supreme Court in the US will now decide whether birthright citizen actually is in the Constitution, yes or no. I don't have I have personal feelings about this, having been naturalized, but I don't also have a theoretical policy answer, except if you read up on citizenship law and naturalization laws, you learn a whole lot about your who belongs to the state. For example, if my mother had been Italian, I would not have been German.